Emily Dickinson was wary of coming to an end. I wish the visit had just begun instead of ending now, she remarks in one of her letters in 1862. But the ongoings have not ended just yet, and her comment highlights how an experience is only fully valued when an end starts to come into focus. Dickinson's poetry often strives to reinvest in the ongoing present, back into the midst of things, to be continually at the meridian, as she puts it in one lyric. Her writing puts to the test Irving Massey's remark that life too, like a sentence, is lived unconsciously, and its meaning in retrospect is another thing. Quite differently, Dickinson is alive to the unfolding nature of experience, to the way in which the creation of meaning doesn't have to be something belated, something recognized only after the fact. Elsewhere, the poet observes, "A word is dead when it is said," some say. I say it just begins to live that day. That just is significant. It registers both incipience and incompletion. To put it another way, a word teeters on the point of existence even at the point of utterance. It's a proposition that brings into question the sufficiency of individual utterances, which are situated instead in an ongoing period of creation. As I will go on to suggest, a similar strain of non-closure is detectable in Dickinson's methods of composition, where her textual revisions and stylistic choices often preserve her poems in unresolved states of creation. The poet's private contemplations over the state of language also have much to say about her attitude towards composition more broadly. Indeed, textual revision is bound up with forms of process. What implications, for example, does revision have not only for the relationship between a reader and a writer's work, but between a writer and her own work? To what extent is one version of a text separate from its previous incarnation? And what and how can one conceive of meaningful patterns that lack a stable end toward which our experience of texts might be oriented? These are questions this paper will entertain as it explores how Dickinson's processes of revision are continuous with the thematic concerns of her poetry. What I want to suggest is that her compositional changes reflect and extend her preoccupation with resisting ends and closure. Moments of seemingly being lost in the midst of experience are reshaped into periods of agency. These anxieties surrounding non-closure range from the quotidian to the cosmic. Take, for instance, the lyric mentioned in the introduction to this paper, wherein the poet contrasts symbolic cognates of enlightenment and skepticism with the possibility of occupying a medial position between the two. What need of day to those whose dark hath so surpassing sun, it deem it be continually at the meridian. These lines invoke and deny multiple kinds of ending. What need of suggests an instrumentality that is now defunct, while surpassing and continually denote a crossing and an ensuing erasure of boundaries. And among those metaphors of dark and light, the poet hovers in a betweenity of complete skepticism and pure knowing. Even so, that interrogative turn in the last line calls into question whether to be continually at the meridian is a plausible conviction. And so this fictive meridian is turned over in the speaker's mind only as a possibility to live into. A lost copy of the poem was published in The Single Hound in 1914, which reveals a different choice of lineation, making the first two lines more equally balanced, and where we find seem instead of deem. In the revised manuscript here, the syntax of the second line swerves into the impersonal construction it deem it be, leaving the antecedent of the first it unclear. A particular source doesn't deem that this meridian is the case, and refraining from treating this betweenity with the certainty of a stable truth or knowledge, Dickinson consciously differentiates it from a substitute kind of telos or knowledge. Instead, an effect of continual is gained as a result of the unfolding event of the stanza. The elongated second line, which reaches out before collapsing in on itself, is swept up along with the isolated adverb continually in the overarching question, as that glides over the fissures in lineation and in sense. As Marilyn Robinson has observed, a question is more spacious than a statement, far better suited to expressing wonder. So Dickinson's revisions to her poem iron in rather than iron out that sense of wonder and bewilderment, bringing incongruent propositions into the prism of that single sentence stanza. Each dash in these lines is a crucial addition. Unlike other forms of punctuation, such as full stops or question marks, a dash can fulfill a purely grammatical function, or it can work in ways that are more mimetic or metaphorical. Here, they come to signify the endless horizon the poet describes, at the same time as they open up rifts in the surface of the text. Indeed, these dashes are not simply structural. They introduce the spontaneity of thought-making back into the poet's writing. Her dashes return us to the moment-by-momentariness of experience, clustering groups of words together in new images, which are then juxtaposed. If, as Dickinson writes in one poem, for pattern is the mind bestowed, these dashes embody the mind at work as it simultaneously harrows old grooves of thought before opening up new channels of possibility. They gesture to and mimetically register everything that happens between words. Elsewhere, dashes sometimes collude with pronounced rhythms in Dickinson's letters, and so enhance these moments of rupture. In 1862, Dickinson writes to her friend Thomas Wentworth Higginson, "I had no monarch in my life and cannot rule myself. And when I try to organize, my little force explodes and leaves me bare and charred." The boundary between prose and verse becomes blurred to an unusual extent. Stresses do not simply fall on significant words. Divided according to Dickinson's punctuation, each clause scans almost perfectly. The first 4 clauses assimilate themselves to alternating tetrameters and trimeters, while the final line again has 3 feet. Although this sentence represents the destructive little force as leaving in ruin any attempt to organize, the rhythmic patterns themselves become a kind of organizing principle. These phrases come to stage an emergence of poetry from Dickinson's own prose. If this ongoing emergence of verse is something that takes place within Dickinson's letters, a more self-conscious exploration of this idea might be found in the compositional circumstances of her letters. Consider this draft poem that she wrote on the back of an envelope. To situations new, the effort to comprise it is all the soul can do. It's one of the poet's most self-conscious emblems of the event of the poem taking place between writer and reader. Like a personalized letter to a close friend, the poem rises to meet its only decent end, as Paul Muldoon puts it, as a solution to a problem that the poem itself has created. Of comprising offers itself up as a possible alternative to the original infinitive to comprise, easing the emphasis on a more purposive trajectory, and allows a more subterranean sense to surface. Comprising now somehow constitutes the very effort and is not simply the intended outcome of toil. And this strange dynamic plays out in the grammar of the poem, as comprise is a cognate of the later emendation, comprehension, as Dickinson finds a grammatical model for the inseparable condition of form and content in poetry. Further down the line, Dickinson preserved her poems in fascicles, a term used by her first editor to describe short bundles or pamphlets of poems that were designed and put together by the poet herself. In effect, these fascicles were the closest she came to a broader project of publication. And yet this method of revising and collating otherwise isolated poems offered an important imaginative resource. It provided Dickinson with a way of keeping her verses in a state of compositional in-betweenness, neither wholly polished for conventional publication, nor wholly rough drafts. But the fascicles also usher in another kind of betweenity, because they bring poems into a more intimate dialogue with one another. 2 poems that begin, "They shut me up in prose," and "This was a poet," are copied into fascicle 21, facing each other like pages in a book. In Helena Higginbotham's eyes, the fascicle enables us to encounter the 2 poems speaking to each other across the page, each opening up interpretative possibilities for the other. They concatenate against each other, she continues, as they echo and speak to each other. Setting prose against poetry on opposing pages, and through the complementary representations of entrapment and liberation, Dickinson creates an impression of poems that are simultaneously forward-facing and backwards-looking. They shut me up in prose, as when a little girl they put me in the closet, because they liked me still. Still, could themselves have peeped and seen my brain go round, they might as wise have lodged a bird for treason in the pound. Himself has but to will, and easy as a star look down upon captivity and laugh no more have I. Lyric poems, Sharon Cameron has argued, attempt to bring about a kind of stasis, as they slow temporal advance to the difficult still point of meaning. And yet Dickinson's self-revisions within the poem and across the fascicle intimate that stasis can be both a threat and a stimulus to poetic composition, as her monosyllabic diction registers the frustrations of a speaker whose voice has been oppressed. Prose may be paralytic then, but verse seems to afford a way out. Over the stanza break, the still that's held at arm's length in its inverted commas transforms into the exclamatory still, and so re-engineers the repressive adjective into something more tonally uncertain. Is that still a cry of indignation, a declaration of freedom, or an affirmation of some enduring condition? On the facing page, Dickinson offers a response to these restrictions. Here, evasive syntax and images of distillation dispel that previous stasis. This was a poet. It is that distills amazing sense from ordinary meanings and a task so immense. From the familiar species that perished by the door, we wonder it was not ourselves arrested it before. Of pictures the discloser, the poet it is he, entitles us by contrast to ceaseless poverty. Of portion so unconscious, the robbing could not harm, himself to him as a fortune exterior to time. Dickinson's pleasure in the poet's distilling capabilities are revealed to full effect in the patterns of her own language, as still from the former lyric is converted into distill here. The jarring effect of tenses in the first two lines evokes an immediate challenge to the conclusive verbs that prevail in They Shut Me Up in prose. Defining what was a poet in terms of an impersonal it is, the speaker refuses to reduce a poet's refining of amazing sense to a finite action, because the strangeness of this syntax turns the moment of recollection into an event or a continuously shocking realization. Poet's craft, she implies, is a continuous process, not something that can be reduced to a quantifiable output of writing. At the same time, however, this isn't to say that the textual dimension of composition is not crucial to this process. Rhymes in these lines compound the turning of the abstract to the more concrete. Immense has sense as its rhyming partner, but it also keeps meanings within earshot, as the abilities of the poet are brought into the realm of the tangible. Our attention is increasingly trained on the pains of textual composition and implicitly on the role of the manuscript page. For Christiane Miller, this poem is an example of what she has called recoverable deletion. In an attempt to rescue the poem from its apparent suppression of meaning, she recasts the first stanza of the lyric as, "This was a poet. It is the fact that this was a poet, which distills amazing sense from ordinary meanings and distills an attar that is so immense." It's as if the poem is a puzzle to be solved, where the reader inherits the task of restoring a condition of integrity and coherence to the text. To put it another way, of redeeming a fallen language to a prelapsarian past. In light of this paper's observations on process and revision, however, what I want to suggest is there's another way of reading the poet's technique here. Indeed, this style of writing might not have been so jarring to Dickinson as it might be to a more contemporary reader. Her classical education, for instance, exposed the young poet to the fact that such verbal compression was not just a natural part of classical verse, but also to Latin more broadly as an inflected language. Her textbook, Stoddard and Andrews' Latin Grammar, which she mentions in her early letters, puts ellipsis as the first figure of syntax in its appendix. And on the next page, under the grouping analogy, we find anacolython as a disagreement in construction between the latter and a former part of a sentence. Each technique here accounts for those syntactical evasions present in the first stanza above. If Dickinson's use of the typographical dash, as I suggested earlier, is one characteristic way she goes about generating meaning through vivid juxtaposition, then this poetic draft offers up a final and exemplary model of the centrality of revision, non-closure, and process to the making of a poem. Thank you all for listening.